In the fall of 1876, high in the mountains where winter didn't just visit but settled in like a permanent enemy, a man named Jacob decided to build something different. The other settlers had already put up their cabins the way their fathers had done and their grandfathers before them: single log walls, mud chinking stuff between gaps, a stone fireplace or iron stove in the corner, and faith that hard work and thicker blankets would be enough to survive whatever the season brought. Jacob had survived one winter like that already. Barely. He had come from Germany with calloused hands and stubborn determination, but nothing in his past had prepared him for the kind of cold that pressed against a cabin like a living thing. The kind of cold that slipped through cracks you couldn't see. The kind that formed frost on the inside of your own walls. He had spent nights feeding the fire until his eyes burned from smoke and exhaustion. He had woken to ice forming along the edges of the wash basin inside the cabin. He had learned that in these mountains, cold was not an inconvenience. It was a test. So when autumn returned, he made a decision that caused the entire settlement to shake their heads. Instead of building a normal single-wall log cabin, Jacob built two walls. First, he stacked full logs the way everyone else did, notched tight at the corners, chinked carefully. Then, instead of calling it finished, he measured 18 inches inward and built a second wall of smaller logs inside the first. 18 inches of empty space between them. The men passing by stopped and stared. "What are you doing?" one asked. "Building it twice," another laughed, but Jacob wasn't finished. Once the inner wall stood firm, he began hauling river stone. Not small handfuls. Not decorative pieces. He hauled heavy granite and sandstone by wagon and by hand, stacking them carefully into the 18-inch gap between the walls. Layer after layer. Stone touching stone. Fitted tight. Rising from the foundation all the way to shoulder height, people didn't just doubt him. They mocked him. "You can't burn rock," someone said. "Stone pulls the heat out of a room," another insisted. "Waste of timber. Waste of time." Jacob listened and kept working. He had noticed something the winter before. When he stood near the fireplace, the stones around it stayed warm long after the flames died. The logs in the walls cooled quickly. The air cooled even faster. But the stones, if heated long enough, held warmth. Not for minutes. For hours. The others thought heat came from fire alone. Burn wood, make warmth. Fire goes out, warmth goes out. Simple. Jacob had realized something deeper. Fire makes heat. But materials decide what happens to that heat. Wood is light. It warms quickly and cools quickly. It doesn't store much energy. Air is even worse. You can heat air fast, but it slips away through cracks and tiny gaps. The warmth rises, disappears, and leaves you shivering before dawn. Stone is different. Stone is heavy. Dense. Slow to change temperature. It takes time to warm it. But once warm, it refuses to give that heat up quickly. Jacob didn't know the scientific words for it. He didn't talk about thermal mass or heat capacity. He simply understood that if he could store heat inside his walls, he could survive the night without feeding the fire every hour. By late November, his cabin looked strange. Thick. Heavy. Darker inside because windows had to be smaller to keep the structure strong. The foundation had to be deeper to support the weight of all that stone. It was more work. More hauling. More sweat. But Jacob wasn't building for comfort during construction. He was building for survival. In January, when winter arrived, it didn't ease in politely. It slammed down. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there. The wind cut through the valley, dragging icy air across the settlement. Smoke rose constantly from cabin chimneys as families fed their fires day and night. In the standard cabins, the routine was the same. Keep the stove roaring. Never let it die. Stack wood by the door. Wake every few hours to add more logs. If the fire burned low, the temperature inside fell fast. Frost formed on window edges. Water froze in buckets left too far from the stove. Floors turned numbingly cold. One family measured 38 degrees inside their cabin by morning. Another barely kept it above 40. Children slept in layers of wool. Adults took turns tending the fire through the night. Wood piles shrank at an alarming rate. Jacob did something different. For 3 straight days in early December, he kept his fire burning steadily, hotter and longer than usual. Neighbors shook their heads again. He's burning through his winter supply already, someone muttered, but Jacob wasn't heating air. He was charging stone. The fire warmed the air. The air warmed the inner log wall. The heat moved into the mass of stone packed between the walls. Slowly. Gradually. Deep into the granite and sandstone. The outer wall, insulated by the trapped stone core and sealed tight, slowed the escape of that heat to the outside air. After 72 hours of steady burning, the stone inside his walls was fully warm from bottom to top. Then the true test came. One night, the temperature outside plunged to -22 degrees. The wind drove the chill even lower. Across the settlement, families pushed their stoves harder. They fed wood into the flames until sparks climbed the chimneys. Even so, the cabins struggled to hold warmth. By midnight, many interiors hovered just above freezing. In Jacob's cabin, the fire burned until midnight as well, then he let it die. Hours passed, the temperature inside did not collapse. The stone walls, heavy with stored heat, began releasing it slowly back into the cabin. Not in a rush. Not in bursts. But steadily, like a bank paying out saved coins. By morning, when Jacob rose to relight the fire, the cabin had cooled, but only slightly. It was still comfortably above 50 degrees. The air felt mild compared to the deadly cold outside. In other cabins, people woke to breath fogging in the air. Some found ice forming on the inside of walls. Jacob's family slept through the night. Word spread quickly. A neighbor came to see for himself. He stepped inside and stopped. The difference was immediate. No desperate roaring fire. No frantic feeding of wood. Just steady warmth radiating from the walls themselves. He touched the interior log surface. It felt warm. Not just near the stove, everywhere. How? He asked. Jacob pointed to the walls. It holds the heat, he said simply. The men who had laughed now brought thermometers. They measured carefully. 64 degrees inside one evening while the outdoor air hovered below zero. 32 degrees warmer than the air outside. 25 degrees warmer than many of their own cabins, and Jacob was burning half the wood. The reason was not magic. It was not trickery. It was physics. In a normal cabin, heat energy from a fire warms the air. The warm air rises and leaks out through gaps, cracks, and thin walls. When the fire dies, there is little stored heat left in the structure. The temperature drops rapidly. In Jacob's cabin, the fire warmed the stone core. That stone, weighing several tons, absorbed enormous amounts of energy. When the fire stopped, the stone did not cool instantly. It released its heat slowly back into the air. Even as the outdoor temperature remained brutally low, the stored heat kept the interior stable. The double wall system also reduced drafts. The 18-inch gap filled with stone eliminated air pockets that could circulate cold air. The outer wall blocked wind. The inner wall protected the living space. Between them sat a thermal battery. The neighbors began to understand. At first, they had believed insulation alone was the key. Stop drafts. Seal cracks. Burn more wood. But insulation slows heat loss, it does not store heat. Jacob's design did both. It slowed escape and stored energy. Over the rest of that winter, the numbers told the story clearly. Families in standard cabins burned through wood stacks faster than expected. Some had to buy more. Some rationed and endured colder nights. Jacob maintained higher temperatures and used far less fuel. It was not just about comfort. It was about safety. Prolonged exposure to cold inside a home leads to illness, frostbite, exhaustion. Stable warmth changes everything. By spring, men who had once mocked the crazy wall asked for measurements. How wide was the gap? 18 inches. How much stone? As much as the foundation could safely hold, thousands of pounds. What type? Dense river stone for storage. Sandstone for slower release. Did it require constant fire? No. Just steady heat long enough to charge the mass. They began building their own. The next winter, several new cabins stood in the valley with double walls packed with stone. The results repeated. Warmer nights. Lower wood consumption. Greater safety. What Jacob had done was not invention from nothing. Variations of heat-storing construction had existed for centuries in other parts of the world. Thick masonry walls in Europe. Heated stone systems in Asia. Underground homes insulated by earth. But in that mountain valley, among men used to single log structures, it looked radical. The real lesson was simple but powerful. Most people think warmth comes from fire alone, but survival in extreme cold depends on how well you manage energy after the fire is lit. Generate heat, yes. But more importantly, store it. Control its movement. Slow its escape. Release it when needed. Jacob's wall was not crazy. It was strategic. It required more labor at the beginning. More materials. A stronger foundation. Patience to heat the stone thoroughly. But once built, it worked with nature instead of fighting it. The mountains did not reward tradition blindly followed. They rewarded adaptation. Years later, when newer building materials became common and people relied on thinner walls stuffed with manufactured insulation, many forgot the power of thermal mass. Modern homes heated quickly, but they cooled quickly too. Turn off the furnace, and the temperature dropped fast. The system depended on constant energy input. Jacob's cabin operated differently. It warmed slowly. It cooled slowly. It created stability, and stability, in a brutal winter, is everything. The story of the crazy wall spread quietly, not through books or advertisements, but through lived experience. Through men stepping inside and feeling the difference. Through families sleeping better. Through wood piles lasting longer. In the end, the laughter stopped. What remained was a simple truth carved into stone and timber. Sometimes the idea that sounds foolish is simply ahead of its time. Jacob did not argue with his neighbors. He did not lecture them with complicated explanations. He built differently. Then he let winter decide. Winter delivered its verdict in degrees. 32 degrees warmer while others froze. His family stayed warm, not because he burned more wood, but because he understood what to do with the heat once he had it. And that understanding turned a crazy wall into a life-saving one. Winter delivered its verdict in degrees. 32 degrees warmer while others froze. His family stayed warm, not because he burned more wood, but because he understood what to do with the heat once he had it. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because once the men of the valley accepted that Jacob's crazy wall worked, a new question took hold of them. If this much heat could be stored inside stone, how far could the idea go? Through the late winter of 1877, the settlement changed in small but important ways. Men who had once spent their evenings arguing about trapping routes and cattle prices now argued about wall thickness and stone density. Instead of boasting about the size of their woodpiles, they measured how long their cabins stayed warm after the fire burned out. Jacob never claimed to be a teacher, but he became one anyway. He showed them how he had laid the first outer log wall exactly as tradition required: tight notches, sealed corners, careful chinking. That part had not changed. What changed was what came next. He explained why the second wall had to be structurally independent, not simply boards nailed inside. It had to stand as a true barrier. The space between walls had to be consistent. 18 inches was not chosen randomly. It was wide enough to hold serious mass, narrow enough to prevent large air circulation loops that would carry heat upward and out. He showed them how the stones had to be fitted tightly. Air gaps inside the stone core would reduce efficiency. Heat moves more easily through solid material than through moving air. The tighter the fit, the steadier the transfer. He described how the foundation had to be stronger than usual. Stone weighs far more than timber. Without proper support, the walls would settle unevenly. He had dug 4 feet down before laying the base stones. Others who copied him without reinforcing their foundations would later learn why that mattered. By early spring, several men began planning rebuilds or additions. The first to follow was William Thorpe, once the loudest critic. He was a practical man. He did not cling to pride when proof stood in front of him. He tore down one wall of his existing cabin and rebuilt it as a double structure, filling the cavity with stone hauled from the river. When the next winter arrived, Thorpe's cabin stayed nearly as warm as Jacob's. He admitted openly that the design had merit, that admission carried weight. Within 3 years, dozens of cabins in the valley incorporated some version of the double wall system. Some experimented with thicker cores, 2 feet instead of 18 inches. Others combined stone with packed earth for added mass. A few even built full masonry interior walls near their stoves to increase storage capacity. The effect was noticeable across the settlement. Wood consumption dropped significantly. Where families once burned nearly 3 cords per week during deep cold spells, many now used half that amount. Fewer emergency wood purchases. Less frantic chopping during blizzards. More stable sleep. But the true power of Jacob's idea became clear during a later winter, even harsher than the one that had first proven him right. In January of 1883, a cold front swept down from the north with brutal force. Temperatures plummeted again below -20. Windstorms piled snow high against cabin walls. For days, outdoor work became nearly impossible. In older single-wall cabins that still stood on the edge of the valley, the old pattern returned. Fires roared non-stop. Interiors fluctuated wildly between too hot near the stove and painfully cold near the floor. When firewood ran low during a storm that prevented hauling more, temperatures dropped dangerously fast. In the double-wall cabins, however, something different happened. Even when storms forced families to reduce fire intensity to conserve fuel, the interior temperatures declined slowly and predictably. The stone cores released stored heat for hours. Instead of waking to near-freezing air, families woke to manageable coolness. Instead of panicked midnight stoking, they slept longer stretches. It was not luxury. It was stability. And stability in extreme cold is safety. As the years passed, the valley earned a quiet reputation among neighboring settlements. Travelers who stopped for trade or rest noticed how warm the homes felt compared to similar elevations elsewhere. They asked questions. Some copied the design when they returned home. The technique spread, not in newspapers or advertisements, but through observation and word of mouth, Jacob himself never grew wealthy from the idea. He did not patent it. He did not charge for instruction. He believed knowledge that saved lives should not be hoarded. He spent his later years helping others refine their designs. One refinement came almost by accident. A younger builder experimented by placing denser granite stones near the bottom of the wall cavity and lighter sandstone higher up. His reasoning was simple. Heat rises. The upper wall surfaces might benefit from faster release materials, while the lower sections could act as long-term reservoirs. The result surprised them. The temperature inside remained even more balanced from floor to ceiling. The lower walls held deep, steady warmth. The upper sections responded more quickly to fresh heat from the stove. Another builder added small, controlled vents at the top of the inner wall to allow limited convection circulation within the cavity. This prevented moisture buildup and helped distribute heat more evenly across the stone mass. The system evolved gradually, not through theory alone, but through testing, through winters that punished mistakes and rewarded improvement. Outside the valley, however, building trends were changing. Railroads expanded. Manufactured materials became cheaper and more widely available. Sawn lumber replaced hand-hewn logs. Eventually, lightweight insulation materials appeared. They promised quick installation and strong resistance to heat loss. Many newer settlers chose speed and cost over mass and labor. Why haul tons of stone when thinner walls could be assembled in days? At first, it seemed like progress. The new cabins heated quickly. Light a stove, and the air warmed fast. But when the fire died or fuel ran out, temperatures dropped just as quickly. The structure itself held little stored energy. Some families adapted by maintaining constant fire. Others installed larger stoves. Fuel remained abundant enough for many years that the difference seemed minor, but old-timers who had lived in Jacob-style cabins noticed the contrast. The new houses are warm, one remarked, but they don't stay warm. It was a subtle but important difference. As mechanical heating systems developed in the 20th century, reliance on constant energy input became normal. Furnaces replaced wood stoves. Thermostats replaced judgment. Walls became thinner, lighter, faster to build. Thermal mass faded from common frontier memory, yet the principle never stopped being true. In places where thick masonry construction persisted, stone farmhouses in Europe, adobe homes in the Southwest, earth-sheltered dwellings, the same stability appeared. Slow heating. Slow cooling. Steady comfort. Decades later, when energy costs rose and environmental awareness increased, architects and engineers began rediscovering what Jacob had learned by necessity. They studied thermal mass in passive solar design. They calculated specific heat capacity and density. They measured cooling curves in heavy-walled structures. Their findings mirrored what that mountain men had proven without equations. Materials matter. Air is easy to heat but easy to lose. Lightweight insulation slows loss but does not store energy. Dense mass absorbs energy and releases it gradually. Modern thermal mass homes incorporate concrete floors, stone interior walls, and carefully positioned windows to capture sunlight. They design for heat storage during the day and release at night. The language is more technical now, but the principle is the same. Generate heat, store heat, control heat, release heat slowly. Jacob's cabin stood for decades after his death. Weathered logs grayed with age. Stone remained solid and unmoved. Visitors who stepped inside even years later reported the same sensation, a quiet steadiness in temperature, a lack of sharp swings. He had not built merely for one winter. He had built for every winter that followed. The story of the crazy wall carries lessons beyond architecture. It reminds us that ridicule often greets innovation. That new ideas, especially when they challenge tradition, appear foolish before they prove themselves. That understanding deeper principles sometimes requires stepping outside inherited habits. The men who mocked Jacob were not ignorant. They were experienced. Their cabins had stood for years. Their methods had worked well enough, but well enough is different from best possible. Jacob did not reject tradition entirely. He built upon it. He kept the log structure. He kept the stove. He kept the craftsmanship. He added one critical element. He asked a question others had not asked. What if the walls could do more than block wind? What if they could store warmth? That single shift in thinking changed outcomes by 32 degrees. In a mild climate, 32 degrees might mean comfort versus slight chill. In sub-zero mountain winter, 32 degrees means survival versus danger. It means frostbite prevented. Illness avoided. Fuel saved. Sleep uninterrupted. It means children waking warm instead of shivering. As time moved forward, many settlements modernized. Lightweight framing replaced heavy timber. Stone became decorative rather than structural. Speed became priority, but in remote regions, among those who understood cold intimately, variations of Jacob's approach persisted quietly. Some combined earth burning with stone cores. Some integrated masonry stoves that routed smoke channels through interior stone benches to maximize heat transfer before exiting the chimney. Others built partial double walls only on the north-facing sides most exposed to wind. Each variation reflected the same understanding. The building itself can participate in heating, not just the stove, not just the furnace, the structure. In recent years, as concerns about energy efficiency and resilience grow stronger, builders once again examine heavy wall construction. They test concrete forms, rammed earth, insulated masonry blocks. They simulate heat retention curves on computers. When they measure slow cooling rates, 2 degrees per hour, sometimes less, they rediscover what a man in the mountains once learned by observation. Heat stored in mass is reliable. It does not depend on electricity. It does not vanish the moment flame disappears. It remains, quiet and steady, radiating back into living space. There is something deeply reassuring about that. Perhaps that is why the image of Jacob's cabin endures in local stories. Not because it was fancy. Not because it was grand. But because it was wise. He did not fight winter with constant panic. He prepared for it with patience. He invested labor up front so that hardship later would be lighter. He built thick when others built thin. He thought long when others thought immediate. And when the cold came, inevitable, merciless, impartial, it revealed the difference clearly. 32 degrees, not luck, not miracle, design. Today, if you stand in a cold climate and step from a lightweight heated structure into one built with substantial thermal mass, you can feel the difference even before you check a thermometer. The air feels calmer. The warmth feels deeper, less fleeting. That sensation is the quiet echo of the same principle that once silenced laughter in a mountain valley. The crazy wall was never crazy. It was patient. It understood that winter is long, that fire is temporary, that survival favors those who think beyond the flame, and in that understanding, a simple double wall filled with stone became more than construction. It became wisdom shaped into shelter.